Thank you for listening to the Victory Podcast. Today's podcast is from September 6th, 2020. Join us as we continue our series in the book of Hebrews with Pastor Dax.
Okay, Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come, and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. So reads the words of the living God. I want to start this morning by asking you a question that I think is becoming a question that is growing in importance and relevance. Brothers and sisters, in the midst of a culture that is increasingly antagonistic towards Christianity, how can you successfully endure in your Christian faith? If anything, the events of the last 6 months or so have revealed that our country is not a Christian nation. Not to say that Christianity wasn't influential in the development of this country, but gone are the days when Christianity was respectable or acceptable or even tolerable. All things that reek of the gospel of Jesus Christ are increasingly rejected and hated and actively trying to be dismantled by a large segment of our society. And what's interesting about that phenomenon is some of us seem surprised. There's no doubt that in God's providence, we as Americans have reaped several benefits that have allowed us to freely worship the one true living God. But friends, the experience of the wider church, capital C church, is very consistent. The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ inevitably arouses a response that transcends time and place and culture. And that is, it arouses a response of hostility and antagonism. Remember what Jesus told his disciples just hours before he went to the cross? If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. He says, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Now, there are ways, of course, of avoiding this persecution. Withdrawal is one strategy. Isolation, just order your life so that you minimize your interaction with the world and you can avoid persecution. Another strategy is silence. Just resolve to never bring up the subject of the gospel among those who aren't already professing believers. That will minimize your persecution. And then there's the middle way of compromise as well. You can simply tie your Christianity to the leash that culture holds so that it behaves well and doesn't stray off into areas where it doesn't belong. There are ways of avoiding this persecution, but we're not asking, how can a Christian avoid persecution at all costs? Because Jesus' words imply that such a thing is not possible for a faithful Christian. The question we're asking is, in the midst of a culture that is increasingly antagonistic towards Christianity, how can you successfully endure in your Christian faith? And When I say successfully endure, success there is defined as being faithful to the mission that you've been given by Jesus Christ, to make the gospel message known to people who are perishing under God's wrath, to call family members, friends, colleagues, teammates, fellow students, neighbors to the forgiveness of sins and the hope of eternal life that is found only in Jesus Christ. How can that kind of Christian, a faithful Christian, successfully endure in the midst of a culture that is increasingly antagonistic? That's the very question that these original readers of this letter, these Hebrew Christians, were asking. You see, in the midst of the intensifying opposition, the increasing Roman hatred and hostility that they were experiencing toward the gospel, they weren't just asking, what do we have to do to survive? Rather, they were asking, how will we successfully endure? Because the writer of Hebrews has made one thing very clear. They cannot turn back. He just warned them. We looked at this last week in the paragraph right above the one we're looking at. In the very strongest possible terms, that to forsake Jesus Christ is eternally fatal. In fact, it's one of the starkest warnings that there is in all of Scripture about not persevering. But now, in the passage that we're looking at today, the writer follows up on that severe warning by showing these Christians how to persevere. All throughout this letter, he's been exhorting Christians to persevere. He's also been warning Christians about the consequences of not persevering. And now, finally, he gets to the very practical how question. How do Christians successfully persevere? How do Christians successfully endure? And if you have your Bible open, you can see in this paragraph that this primary concern is revealed in two very strong statements that lie right in the middle of this paragraph, like a bullseye. The first statement is negative, the second one is positive. Here's the positive one in verse 35, right in the middle of the paragraph. So we're going to start in the middle and work our way out. Verse 35, therefore do not throw away your confidence. Now that word confidence is very significant in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 4, remember, after Peter and John, they've healed this crippled man, and they've been interrogated by the religious leaders. And Peter, remember this scene? He stands up, filled with the Holy Spirit, and he looks these guys in the eye, the very same men who were responsible for pronouncing a death sentence on Jesus a few days earlier, 50 days earlier. And he says to the Sanhedrin, if we are being examined today concerning a good deed done to a crippled man, by what means this man has been healed, let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man is standing before you well. He continues, he says, this Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone, and there is salvation in no one else. For there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. And then in Acts 4:13, he says this, or it says this, Luke writes, now when they saw the boldness, that word boldness, it's the same word translated confidence in Hebrews 10:35. When they saw the boldness, the confidence of Peter and John, they were astonished. So back to Hebrews 10:35, do not throw away your confidence, your boldness in Jesus Christ. Despite all of the increasing persecution and hostility, don't throw away your confidence in Jesus to save you, as though his work was some kind of unimportant and worthless thing. So don't do that. That's the negative side. The positive side is found in verse 36, Hebrews 10:36. For you have need of endurance. Don't throw away your confidence, for you have need of endurance. And need is the operative word here. The idea is not just that endurance is a desirable thing. like it's a really good idea if you try to endure. That's not the idea. It's that endurance is absolutely necessary. You need to do this. Your perseverance is indispensable. In fact, it is contingent upon your full experience of salvation. So that's the center of this exhortation. This is the bullseye of this whole paragraph. Negatively, do not throw away your confidence in Jesus Christ to save you. Positively, you must endure. You must persevere in the faith. Now, we've heard this writer say this kind of thing all throughout this letter. And I'm sure that you, just like these Hebrew Christians probably at this point, were saying, we get it. Okay, we get it. Don't turn back, persevere. Don't walk away, press on. We understand that, but how? How do we do that, especially in the midst of increasing persecution and hostility? How do we keep our confidence in Jesus Christ? How do we endure? And friends, that's the very same question I want you to be asking yourself this morning. So don't disengage now. Don't think that you're exempt from this just because you really haven't experienced much persecution in your life. We've already established here, Jesus' own words teach us that faithful Christians will be persecuted, regardless of when and where they live. Because the judgment of God that is contained in the message of the gospel offends people, regardless of when and where they live. So the issue is not really, will you ever experience persecution? The issue is, will you ever be faithful enough about the gospel to experience persecution? Because if you will, the answer is yes, persecution will come. Maybe not in the same way that these Hebrew Christians experienced it, but it will come. Simply because people love the darkness and hate the light. And this is something that will prove to be true for you as an individual. It is something that will be proven true for all of us together as a church. The more outspoken you are with the message of the gospel, the more hostility you will arouse. The more definitive we become as a church about the message of the cross, the greater the antagonism that will come our way. So if withdrawing or staying silent or compromising, if those are not legitimate options for a faithful Christian, then persecution is always the inevitable outcome, eventually. So how can you endure it successfully? That's what we're asking. And I have two answers to that question. How can you endure successfully? By doing two things. Number one, by recalling your past expressions of confidence. By recalling your past expressions of confidence. And number two, by fixing your preoccupations on the blessings of the future. These are the two ways that you can endure successfully as a Christian. First, by recalling your past expressions of confidence. Secondly, by fixing your preoccupations on the blessings of the future. And the key word here is really that little word, but, at the beginning of verse 32. See it there, that little word, but. It sets up a contrast now with the very strong warning that we saw last week in verses 26 through 31, with what follows now in verses 32 through 39. So this is sort of like, imagine if you are, you have small children and you're in your house looking through the window and your kids are kind of just playing in the front yard, and you notice one of them start to go towards the street. And so you yell out, "Hey, stop, stop! Don't cross the street, it's dangerous!" And maybe even your child gets a little teared up because your voice is so stern. Why are you so mad at me? So what do you do next? Just go back inside and close the door and continue on with whatever you were doing? No, it's a teachable moment, right? So you walk over to where your child is, you give him a big hug, and you say, "The reason I spoke so strongly to you is because I love you and I don't want anything to happen to you." Now, the child will always remember how severe the warning was, but now they will also know that the motivating force behind that warning was always love for them. That's what's happening here in this passage. Verses 26 through 31 are this severe shout to persecuted Christians. It's like he's saying, don't cross the street. That's dangerous. Don't you know what happens if you turn your back on Jesus Christ? But now it's like the writer comes to them and gives them a big hug to encourage them here in this passage. And it all begins with that word but in verse 32. It's like he's saying, even though others are turning away and they will meet an end that is so horrible that it defies description, I'm persuaded of better things for you. And why is that the case? First of all, because of your faithful track record in the past, to which he now calls their attention here in verse 32. But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. That one word, that verb, recall there, it's a present passive imperative plural. What does that mean? It means that contained in that one word recall is really this sense. All of you must be continually reminding yourselves. It's a command to all of them to do something for each other. All of you must be continually reminding yourselves. Recall. Recall what? Recall those early days when you were newly converted. He's asking, do you remember when God's grace invaded your life and he changed your heart and you turned your back on sin and the old ways of Judaism and you trusted in Jesus Christ for your salvation? Remember those days? And remember, it didn't take very long before your faith was put to the test. Look what he says. Recall the former days when after you were enlightened, means after you were saved, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. That word translated struggle, it's the word athlesis. You can hear our English word athletics there. It speaks of a competition, a contest, a conflict. And in this case, the opponent in that contest was a relentless battery of sufferings. Look at verse 33, and this is where you really need your Bible open if you have it. Sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your own property. And I stopped there in the middle of that sentence because of the structure of this passage. We don't have punctuation in the original text. And so the way that this is structured is really in a sort of an A-B-B-A sort of format. If you're familiar with that kind of parallelism, it's almost poetic in that the first phrase and the fourth phrase go together on the ends, and then in the middle, the second phrase and the third phrase go together. So that first phrase, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, goes with the fourth phrase, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. Those go together because it shows that sometimes the sufferings come personally and directly at these individuals. They experience them themselves. But then in the middle, that second phrase, sometimes being partners with those so treated, goes with the third phrase, for you had compassion on those in prison. So sometimes the sufferings were a result of just identifying with other Christians who were experiencing this persecution, not that they were necessarily experiencing it directly themselves. So let's look at these here. This first and fourth phrase, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction. Now that word reproach, it refers to verbal abuse, ridicule, insult. It's the same word that's often used in the New Testament to speak about the verbal reproach that was directed towards Jesus. You know, when people called him a glutton and a drunkard and a madman and a liar and demon-possessed. It's reproach. Affliction refers to acts of violence. And that fourth phrase here now, that really provides us an example of what particular violence is in view. The plundering of your property. Their possessions had been taken from them. Now, whether that was the result of a rioting mob or whether that was the result of a government decree, we're not told. The point is, their confession in Jesus Christ as Lord had brought about this violent persecution. And don't miss the fact that this reproach and affliction were of a public nature, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction. It's the word theatrizo. Theatrizo. Can you hear the word theater there? That word originally meant to bring on stage. Later on, it took a more negative connotation. It means to make a spectacle of, to shame publicly. In other words, this reproach and affliction, it didn't happen off in a corner. It didn't happen in private with just a few people around to see it. The severity of this reproach and affliction were magnified by the fact that these people were made to be public spectacles, which of course served to make a very clear statement to other professing Christians and to any unbelievers who might be considering the merits of the gospel. The message, if you go down this road, this is what you can expect. This was the athlesis. This was the struggle, the sufferings that some of these Christians personally and directly endured, reproach and affliction. But this public persecution wasn't just aimed at Christians because of their personal allegiance to Jesus. And this, I think, is really beautiful, and there's a lesson for us here. This persecution also came about because of Christians who maintained a courageous, Christ-like unity with their brothers and sisters in the gospel who were experiencing persecution. So the second and third phrase here now, sometimes being partners with those so treated. An example, for you had compassion on those in prison. Now, prison ministry, as we know it, is something that is vitally important. In fact, just before stuff started getting shut down, Eric was working on getting a prison ministry kind of up off the ground, and that's something that is not only a neglected ministry and a great gospel opportunity, it's something that we'd like to support and see grow in the future. But prison ministry in the New Testament is quite different than prison ministry in our context. In ancient Rome, prisoners were punished, not pampered. Prisoners were given just the barest essentials, and even then, many of them would die in prison. If a prisoner wanted to eat and drink and be clothed in any kind of dignified way, it would only be as a result of the provisions that their friends supplied to them while they were in prison. But you see, here's the point. To visit a Christian in prison, to care for his needs, that was to put yourself at great risk. Because after all, the only reason that they're in prison is because they're a Christian. And so to visit a Christian in prison in the first century is to also expose yourself as a Christian and face the very real possibility of your own imprisonment. And so knowing that, isn't it amazing how often in the New Testament we read that Christians in the first century are encouraged over and over again to go and visit their brothers and sisters in prison and meet their needs. That's a huge risk. To do that involves an enormous amount of self-sacrifice and love. It's to be like Jesus, who regarded his privileges in heaven not something to be clung to as his right, but who gladly left the glories of heaven to identify himself with us and our desperate condition in order that he might meet our needs. And so it's no accident that the writer says here, having compassion on those in prison, because that's the very same word that's used back in Hebrews 4 to refer to how Jesus sympathizes with our weakness. to minister to other Christians in prison in this context, it's really one of the highest possible expressions of Christian love and unity, because it was to place yourself at personal risk. It's really the embodiment of the principle that Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 12. If one member suffers, all suffer together. So if we put all this together, what do we have here? We have a very strong exhortation to these Hebrew Christians to actively look back and recall their past expressions of confidence in the face of persecution. Why? Because to do that, to remember what had happened in the past, would encourage them to persevere in the present. Verse 35 begins with the word therefore. So as you do this, as you recall your faithfulness and your confidence when you were persecuted in the past, therefore do not throw away your confidence, verse 36, for you have need of endurance. So don't get this turned around. It's not that we look back at our past successes so that we can boast about what we have done to be faithful to God. No, this is to remind ourselves that by the grace of God, I got through that trial in the past. God sustained me through that all, which means what for the present? I have every reason to believe that he'll do the same thing for me again in this current trial that I'm in. So how can Christians successfully endure in the midst of a culture that is increasingly antagonistic towards Christianity? Well, first of all, in part, by recalling your past expressions of confidence, by remembering what God has done in the past to get you through. But that's not the whole picture. Notice here now, we are also called to lift our eyes towards the future. So not just to look back and recall the past, but also to look ahead to the future, to fix our preoccupations on the blessings of the future. How did these Hebrew Christians endure through all of this? Public ridicule, public persecution, public humiliation, the confiscation of their property. I mean, doesn't it seem strange that verse 34 tells us that they joyfully accepted the plundering of their property? How could they do such a thing? Joyfully? Well, quite simply, I think they took Jesus' words to heart. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, there it is, the plundering of your property. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's a very simple principle, but it's undeniably true. If your treasures are here, your heart is here. If your treasures are there, your heart will be there. So how could these Christians endure such persecution? They were looking ahead to what awaited them in heaven. And their response to the plundering of their property was one of the proofs of that. They accepted it joyfully because their preoccupations were fixed on the blessings of the future. Earlier in that same sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus preached about treasures in heaven, he also said this: blessed, and it's a word that could be translated happy. Happy are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Listen, then he says, rejoice and be glad. I mean, are you kidding? How do you do that? Why would you do that? For your reward is great in heaven. It's Matthew chapter 5. Because that is where your affections are fixed. So back to Hebrews 10, and look at this carefully here. there's a theme I want you to trace through these next three verses. End of verse 34. You endured all this since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. What is this better and abiding possession? Well, it's the great reward mentioned at the end of verse 35. Look at it. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Well, what is this great reward? Well, it's to receive the promise at the end of verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, that is, when you have endured to the end, you may receive what is promised. So do you see how you can trace that there? The better and abiding possession is the great reward, is receiving the promise of God. And what does all that refer to? Very simply, it refers to the final experience of salvation, the completed gift of eternal life, the ultimate aim of the Christian. He's saying, keep your eyes on the prize. As you see persecution increasing all around you, fix your preoccupations on the blessings that are to come. And remember, all of this flows out of their past experience of persecution. He's saying this is what sustained you the first time around when you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. He says, since you knew then that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. So let me ask you, is this your perspective? Or do you live as though this is all there is? Are your affections fixed on your health, your wealth, your retirement, your possessions? Where do most of your thoughts go? Where does most of your money go? Where does most of your time go? You see, if you are more concerned with temporal things, you will not persevere when persecution comes. You will not think of Christianity as worthy of the greatest sacrifice because you've already proven it. I think one of the biggest challenges we face in this culture is that our marriage to the world is the reason why we fear persecution so greatly. We have too much to lose. But on the other hand, if you think of yourself in biblical terms as a stranger and an alien on the earth, and your affections are fixed on the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God, as Hebrews 11 talks about, the better and heavenly country where your citizenship has been registered. If that is your perspective, then everything that you have could be taken away from you, and you would be able to joyfully accept it. Can you imagine that? How could that ever be the case? Because as a Christian, for you, the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed by God in the future. So how can you be sure of this as a Christian? How can you be sure that this perspective of endurance, that by doing this you will receive the better and abiding possession, that you will receive this reward, this fulfillment of the promise? And the writer of Hebrews does what he always does so often through this letter. He anchors his hope in the Old Testament scriptures. Look at verse 36 again. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For, it's an important word, so here's the explanation. Here's why you can believe that you will receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come, and will not delay. When Jesus Christ, the coming one, returns, he will bring with him the better and abiding possession, the great reward, the promise fulfilled of salvation. That little word "for" makes this a certainty. How can you know this is true? For he is coming. But in the meantime, what do? Verse 38, but my righteous one shall live by faith. The Christian will live by faith in the promise of God. You will persevere because you have staked everything about your future on the Word of God. That Jesus Christ is coming soon to complete your experience of salvation. And as we'll see soon here, all of chapter 11 is an illustration of this point, that the righteous one shall live by faith. But as I'm sure you noticed, if your Bible's open, these words here are suddenly in quotation marks. And that's because they're pulled from the Old Testament. And we need to just briefly understand the original context of those words in order to fully appreciate what these words from Habakkuk are doing here in the middle of Hebrews. When the prophet Habakkuk first wrote these words, the people of Israel were suffering under violent oppression and tyranny at the hands of the Babylonians. And in that context, Habakkuk asks God, how long will this continue? How long will we have to endure this persecution? And God answers his prophet there. He says, my vision, my revelation will come. And I'm paraphrasing, but he says, if it seems slow to you, just wait for it, because it will come. It will not delay. But until then, the righteous shall live by his faith. Now see this here, what the writer of Hebrews does. He takes that Old Testament promise and he fills it with New Testament meaning. He defines the revelation, the vision. Instead of saying, as it does in Habakkuk, in the original, the vision will come to bring judgment on those who are oppressing God's people, he says, the coming one will come. See what he does? See the distinction? He moves it from a thing that is coming, the revelation, the vision, to a person who is coming, the coming one. And who's that? Now, when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent words by his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the people have good news preached to them. The coming one is Jesus Christ. Habakkuk, he asks God, when will you right all of these wrongs? When will you bring justice on our oppressors? It's the same question that these Hebrew Christians are asking. That may be the same question that you're asking. God, when will you right all these wrongs? And the writer now explains God's answer to Habakkuk. Ultimate justice will be executed when Jesus Christ comes. When the coming one comes. When Jesus returns, not only will the faithful be rewarded, but the apostate will also be judged. Notice it says, and if he shrinks back, if he turns away, if he apostatizes, my soul has no pleasure in him. And yet, faithful Christians are told, but we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed. It speaks of eternal condemnation. But of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Authentic Christians will endure until that which is now by faith becomes sight, and our Savior returns. 1 John 3, verse 2 says, "But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." And what a day that will be. But in the meantime, to sustain you in the present, you must fix your preoccupations, your ambitions, your thoughts, your investments, your affections, your delights. You must turn all of that and fix it on the blessings of the future that are to come. Now, like me, I'm willing to guess that most of you have not experienced a great deal of persecution, if any. But that's not because we have it so easy, living in a quote-unquote Christian country. If we're honest, the reason that we haven't experienced so much persecution has more to do with the fact that we've not been as faithful to the gospel as we ought to be. And so I'm asking this morning, are you ready for that to change in your life? Are you ready for that to change in our church? And you must count the cost. Are you ready for the consequences of that kind of change? Yes, maybe laughter, maybe mocking, maybe misunderstanding, resentment, maybe a bit more seriously, avoidance or rejection, or the damaging of relationships, the loss of friendships. What about being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction? What about being partners with those who are treated in that way? What about imprisonment or the plundering of your property? Or worse? Are you ready for that? Are we ready for that? Brothers and sisters, by the grace of God, we need to be. But how will we do it? How will we successfully endure as Christians in the midst of a culture that is increasingly antagonistic towards Christianity? By recalling past expressions of confidence in the promise of God, and by fixing our preoccupations on the future blessings of God. Jim Elliot said it well, so we'll let him have the last word here. He is no fool who gives up what he can never keep in order to gain what he can never lose. Let's pray.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.